Good evening. Four criteria of electronic music. The first criterion is the unified time structuring. The second criterion is the splitting of the sound. The third, the multi-layered spatial composition. The fourth, the equality of sound and noise, or better, of tone and noise. I would like to thank you very much for coming to listen to what I want to say about these four criteria. One might ask, why are they interesting? As there is electronic music, and everybody can make up his mind what to think about this music. New means change the method. New methods change the experience, and new experiences change man. In particular in the field of music, because the sound waves penetrate very deep into the molecular and atomic layers of ourselves. Whenever we hear sounds, we are changed, we are no longer the same after having heard certain sounds, and this is the more the case when we hear organized sounds, organized by another human being, music. At about 1950, it was no longer self-understood that a sound is a sound, because the idea to compose the sounds themselves came up as a result, we might say, of the historical development, the school of Vienna, of the Viennese composers, had reduced the musical objects, the themes, the motives, to entities of only two sounds, intervals. Webern in particular, Anton von Webern. And when I started to compose music, I certainly was a child of the spirit of the first half of the century, continuing and widening what the composers of the first half had prepared. And it took a little step to have the idea to compose a single sound, to synthesize a sound. I should immediately say that it was a second thought, because I started analyzing all sorts of sounds. I recorded sounds in the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, where you can find all the exotic instruments of wood, of stones, the lithophones, of metal, of all different cultures, and of all the different historical periods. But I also analyzed sounds which I recorded in the daily life, all sorts of noises. I began to study books in which you can find the analysis of vowels, of the classical musical instruments, and one by one, not having had any good training at the music conservatory or at the university in acoustics, one by one, I became aware that a sound is not just a sound. And I became very interested in the differences between the sounds. What is the difference between a piano sound and a vowel ah and the sound of the wind? Oh, and after having analyzed a lot of sounds, this second thought came up. It was always implied. If I can analyze sounds which exist already, which I can record, why can I not try to synthesize sound in order to find new sounds, if possible? And at that time, we had only instruments which tried to imitate classical instruments. You find them in bars, not yet in the symphony orchestras, because the symphony orchestra up to now is a fairly closed sound world because of its social composition. So, for example, no electric organs of the modern type of organs can be found in symphony orchestras easily. But, for example, in pop groups nowadays, you will find a lot of equipment that has been produced by companies who have started building instruments with keyboards and certain registers like organ stops to imitate trumpets, flutes, clarinets, etc. They add now more and more gimmicks to transform these sounds. Nevertheless, there was this catalog, if I might say, of a certain variety of timbres, as we say, like a painter who has got a certain collection of colors which he can buy, and then he starts mixing them. The classical instrumentation up to the present day, with the instruments which we can name, has been an art of mixing. The idea to synthesize a sound must have something that is more basic, more simple than the sounds you can find in the daily life. And I started investigating in acoustic laboratories what might be available as the most simple sound wave, for example, sine wave generators, which were used for measurement. And I started very primitively to synthesize individual sounds by superimposing sine waves in harmonic spectrums in order to make etc., all the vowels. And then I found one by one generators which produce what we call the white noise, comparable to the white color, and which you can filter with electric filter in order to produce colored noise, like etc. And when I make just then it comes very close to certain water noises. There you are. It started very primitively to synthesize the sound. What is important is that I tried more and more, like many others did then in French studios. That's where I began to study these things. It was 23 years. In the group so-called Musique Concrète, they recorded sounds and transformed them with electric devices. for example, speed up sounds. Everybody who has got a record player knows how to speed up or speed down music just by changing the speed. Well, this is very important, that we can, since the late 40th of this century, change the speed of a tape recorder continuously, not just discontinuously, and transform sounds by speeding up sounds. Let's immediately jump to the extreme. Then we come to the first criterion. If you take a Beethoven symphony and speed it up, and if you are able to speed it up in such a way that you do not at the same time transpose the pitch, the register of this Beethoven symphony. Let's say we would have an electric device that it sounds still with the same registers, in the same registers, but we would compress it in time, and we would compress it to such an extent that it would last just 1 second. Then we get a sound which has a particular color, as we say, particular timbre, a particular shape, dynamic shape, and its inner life, which is so highly compressed in time, is what Beethoven has composed. And it is a characteristic sound compared to, let's say, the compression of a piece of gagaku music from Japan. On the other hand, if we take any given sound and spread it out, expand it in time to such an extent that it would last 20 minutes, a sound which lasted, when we recorded it, for 1 second or 2 seconds, then we will have a musical piece. And its form, its large form in time, will be the expansion of the microacoustic structure, time structure, that was in the sound. There we are. I started to compose sounds in a new way about 1955-56. What I did is I recorded, for example, electric pulses, individual pulses. Then I spliced them together in particular rhythm. Then I made a tape loop with this rhythm. Let's say you have tak, tak, tak. And then that is the rhythm, just as simple as possible, and make a loop and speed it up. Tarak tak, 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 etc. Then it becomes continuous, and then when I speed it up, then after a while you hear a very low sound rising, which means when this little period is no longer tarak tak, tarak tak, tarak tak, tarak tak, which is almost a second, tarak tak, tarak tak, but it would last, let's say, 1/16 of a second, then this period determines the periodic, what we call the fundamental period of a sound, which is a very low organ sound, 16 vibrations per second, we say. And its color, its timbre, is the result of tarak-tat, compared to tarak-tatarat, takatatarat, takatatarat, that would give a different color. Naturally, you don't hear the rhythm anymore, but you hear a specific, what we call a color, which is a specific kind of a composition of its components, spectrum. Well, now imagine that you speed up a sound, a rhythm which lasted 1 second, 1,000 times, then the individual period lasts 1,000th of a second, which means you have a sound in the middle range of audibility, with a constant pitch. Well, it's about 2 octaves above the middle of the piano. 1,000 cycles per second. And it has a particular timbre. So I made a lot of experiments with different rhythms in order to see what do these different rhythms give as differences in timbre. And there we are. What, under a certain perspective, is perceived as a rhythm, in a faster time of perception, is perceived as pitch, with its melodic qualities. You can build melodies by changing the basic period, making it faster or slower. That means the sound goes up or down. And when I have such a basic periodicity, and I have these inner subdivisions given by a rhythm, then I, as I said, have the so-called partials, the subdivision of periodicity. And I perceive it as the so-called timbre, the differences in color. Now, if this sound is not periodic, but changes the periodicity a little faster, a little slower, or to be more precise, a little longer, a little shorter, the individual periods, then the sound starts oscillating around a certain middle frequency. And all the half vowels or half consonants, for example, zzz, they are already fairly broad in oscillating around a middle frequency. So the continuum between a sound with a fixed pitch and a noise is nothing but more or less stable periodicity. And the noisiest noise is the most aperiodic periodicity, if you like. It's no longer periodic. And that's what we perceive as noises. This was extremely important, that the continuum between sound and noise, about which I will speak as the fourth criterion of today's talk, the continuum becomes available. You can control it. You can compose it, organize it. Now we speed down any given rhythm, and we come into the realm of form, what we consider being form. What is form in music? Well, usually we say a musical piece lasts between, let's say in the entertainment music, between 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and a Mahler symphony, which might last an hour and a half, but that is approximately the longest we have encountered in our tradition. There are a few operas which last longer, in particular operas of the end of the 19th century, which brought in very important expansions of the musical time. But there's nothing like, let's say, the Omitsutori in Japan, in the Todaiji temple in Nara, which lasts 3 days and 3 nights without any break. Or a certain musical ritual in a certain tribal situation in, let's say, as you might still find it in Ceylon or in Africa. There you are. We are already in a fixed perspective of our tradition that we say the form varies between dimensions of 2, 3 minutes and 90 minutes. This is 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and 128, 7 octaves, as we say, 7 times 2. It's, amazingly enough, the same range as we have in the field of what we call rhythm and meter, which is everything that is now the next subdivision of the larger former sectionings, the former entities, formal entities. And they are organized in bars, traditionally always, if possible, in the same periodicity, which means a tempo was fixed for one movement, let's say fast or medium fast or slow. Then they changed the tempo because everything was derived from dancing or moving the body. That's where the music comes from. Well, there we are. We have, what do we have? Let's say form begins, if you object, please raise your arms. Let's say approximately at 8 seconds and goes from 8 seconds to 90 minutes, or let's say something between 1 and 2 hours. Everything that's beyond 8 seconds, it has something to do with our perception. we remember less and less well. If duration is 13 seconds or 15 seconds, I would like to make the test. Can hardly be recognized, but you know very well that this difference of 2 seconds, if I have a sound of 1 second or 3 seconds, is enormous. So our perception is logarithmic and not arithmetic. This is important, that rhythm has its own field of perception with some transitional regions. Let's say between 8 and 16 seconds, there is a transition between rhythm and form. Rhythm has, again, its particular field of perception. 8 seconds. A sound of 8 seconds is da, da, etc. Now I don't move my hand. Da, see, it makes a very slow movement, and we are already entering into proportions where form begins, where we can clearly, like in an architecture, subdivide the time in terms of formal sections. Now 8, 4, 2, 1, a half, a fourth, 1/8, 1/16. 1/8 is the fastest we can play with our fingers. That's determined by the muscles and the construction of our body. 8 attacks, let's say, per second. That is, I could go up to 16 perhaps, or 12 or 13, 14, with very special rolling movements of my 2 hands, but then it's finished. There you see again, it's 7 times the double. 7 to 8 times the double. It's very interesting. It is almost the same range of perception. And then we start, then the low sounds, if you would do it faster, you know that from the previous example. It's slightly faster, only 16 per second. You hear the low? You hear still the individual pulses of my chord, from my instrument here. And then, etc. The sound begins. That's why we call it pitch. And in between there is a region where we don't know what it really is, if we still can count the attacks or not. So there we are. Another 7 octaves, as you know from the keyboard of the piano. It has 7 to 8 octaves, 7.5 exactly. And then what is beyond that is just brilliance, coloring frequencies. Another 3,000 cycles is the highest about cycles per second of the piano. Then 6,000, 12,000, and then it's almost finished with older people. And no, it's finished really. We're at 10,000, 12,000. Well, you all get old. Don't worry about this. Then the music sounds, all music sounds very sweet because the brilliant high sound is no longer perceived too much. Yeah, like most people who listen to the radio, they shut off the high frequencies. And the music sounds very nice. There we are. The ranges of perception are ranges of time of perception. And the time is subdivided by us, by the construction of our body and our instruments to perceive. This is extremely interesting. But a composer, for example, since having found the means, the modern means, to continuously change from one into the other, changes a rhythm into pitch, which means into tones or noises. A tone or a noise into a formal proportion. He goes through a unified musical time and composes in a unified musical time. That changes completely the traditional concept of how to compose and to think music. Because these were boxes. Harmony, melody was one, and then rhythm meter was another one. Then periods, phrases, phrasing, articulating periods, and larger entities was the section of forming. And then in the timbre field, we had only names. We said oboe, or female voice, or we said piano, or we said a bird sound. Which means we had just very few words with which we describe the sound sources. But we have, fortunately, a very poor language to describe sounds. I mean, much poorer than in the visual field. That's why in the visual field, almost all the perception has been rationalized and has no longer any magic. Has become pretty dull, I would say, because it has been put into boxes, and we have so many words to identify visual events, colors, shapes, etc., etc. Even in music, we speak of the white noise. We speak of the high sounds, which comes from spatial experiences. High sound. We should say the fast sound, and even with particular description of the speed. Or we say low sounds, or we say dark sounds, or bright sounds, etc. There you see, fortunately, apart from saying whispering, all the onomatopoetic words, or what is it? Whispering, or, well, I know in German, zischend, or wischend, and the lowest are tutend, or bellend, or heulend. These are onomatopoetic words which describe with a word what we hear. But they have come out of use. In music, there is the instrumentation describing the available sound sources. This being said, I play now the first example of this lecture. I have chosen 4 sections from a work which is called KONTAKTE. KONTAKTE for electronic sounds. Did you rewind it? Let's start again, and I make the curb. Leave the lights on, please. Yes. Sound is longer and longer, pretty dark, and now it brightens up. There it is, continuous. Now listen. It has ooh, which means almost no overtones. It goes over all, there it is. High, E, E. It disappeared. And now with this single sound which I have obtained, I work for another 4 minutes. Just follow its curve. Very little intervals. Very small intervals. These are like other objects are passing by, but there's always this line of orientation. They pass by. Just looking out of the window. Now listen. Goes away very far. I will remind you. There it comes again. These are extremely small intervals. You wouldn't believe it. Fractions of a second minor second. It's like giving perspective to that sound. Always clack, clack, these, which comes from different sides. Higher, lower. That's like reaching a new planet. Sounds like craws. I tell you later how I made them, these craws. Remember this. Yeah, remember this sound. How it sounds like. Brrr, this. The next example will begin with that last sound here, and I use it to interpret it in order to clarify what I called the splitting of the sound. If we have understood that a sound can be composed, literally put together, not just as we say as a stationary sound which doesn't change, but even ow, which is a non-stationary sound because it changes during the course of its duration. If we can compose it, put them together as componere, as it says from the Latin. Componere, composition, means to put together. Then, naturally, we can think in terms of, please, in quotation marks, decomposition of a sound. Which means we split the sound, and this is in a certain context, much more revealing and interesting than hearing a unified sound and taking it as it is and comparing it to another one, which is at the happening at the same time or before or after this particular sound. What I mean by this is this one is serving now for another section of the composition KONTAKTE, and you will hear that this sound one by one is revealing itself as being a composed one, which means it has components. And one by one, the individual components, 6 in all, leave the original frequency. Very slowly in glissandi, going up or down. The order is down, up, down, as in the previous example. They break literally apart into their rhythmic components, into the individual pulses, but the original, so-called original frequency remains until the end of the section, and the sound literally splits up into 6 components. And each individual component is rhythmically decomposing in front of our ears. And you will realize that whenever a component, a component, is leaving the original frequency, then the timbre of that original sound changes naturally. And that makes us aware that it has been a composed one. So what do I do as a composer? Well, is it an acoustical example of a lecture of a physicist or of an acoustician who says, ladies and gentlemen, today I'm speaking about the subject of sound decomposition, and this is an example. So then music would be just reduced to pedagogic functions, like in the previous example too. Well, it is true that whereas traditionally in music and art in general, the content, or let's say the ideas, the themes, were more or less descriptive, either psychologically descriptive or descriptive about certain phenomena in the world or interhuman relationships. A composition or a decomposition of a sound, or the passing through several time layers, it may be the theme itself. Rather than meaning something with the sound, its own behavior is the meaning, its own life. And we live through exactly the same transformations that the sound is going through, and by that we change. For example, if the sound splits into 6, and we want to follow them all 6, we have to split ourselves into 6. We have to become polyphonic beings, multi-layered beings, to follow several layers of a process at the same time. Or when the sound is falling 6.5 octaves down, and you are not just fixed in your time chair, so to speak, then you have to go with it, otherwise you don't perceive it. You have to fall 6.5 octaves. That's why many people get a very strange feeling in their stomach when they hear that first example. There you are. The theme of the music, of composition itself, is the revealing of such processes, or the composition of such processes. But they could be made more or less intelligently. I mean, let's say a physics professor would just make 6.5 octaves down. Now you hear it, just there you are. And someone else might just make etc. It's a little bit more inventive, I would say. Well, if you can do it better, then the same process has been composed by different people, and one is more imaginative than the others. That's all that is about different composers. And that's also all that is about the difference between a physics professor and a composer in this context. Maybe there are certain how can we say, multi-layered beings who are several beings at the same time. That is very good then. like we have many visual artists nowadays who are mainly concerned with the exploration of new ways of seeing. The seeing itself is the theme. The way how to look at things and what we can see. It is the widening of our perception, and at the same time, as I say, most things that I see in such galleries are absolutely dull. I mean, I just see it, and I understand, yes, that's it. Or my eyes are flickering, and then I say, well, okay, I have understood. My eyes flicker and when you do this, etc. It's a kind of relationship one feels like these animals in experiments, which have to show a certain reaction to a certain stimulus. That's what much of modern art is about, too, I must say. We are in a very important transition from a traditional way of perceiving art and a new way of art, making and perceiving art. We discover new functions, which is that the art itself is revelatory, is revealing existence and ourselves and changing us as human beings. And once this has started, a human being of today and in 100 years are almost incomparable, even physiologically. Don't think that we remain the same when our perception is changing so drastically, and when, for example, the perspective of musical perception becomes relative rather than absolute. Let's say the timing. When I have to pass so quickly through all speeds and tempi in music, I change completely. And I am no longer comparable to someone who is sitting in his time chair, so to speak, at metronome 60, where his heart is beating, or at metronome, let's say, 30 or 20, where his lungs are breathing, and everything that is faster he considers as being fast, and everything that is slower he considers being slow, and there he has his fixed perspective. I mean, what we need, or what we will become, as individuals, not all of us, naturally, are beings who can change very quickly in time and space as well. Very quickly. And go through all these transformations and, yes, become the sounds. And this is certainly the most profound musical way of experiencing. To become what we experience, and by that expand, change, grow. The second example will be played now, and please leave the lights on. Aha, has it started? Yeah, there it is. Now follow this sound, please. you may have realized that one has to be very alert to follow the components leaving and following also the original. And I play it again. As each component decomposes into little pulses, which are then floating in an acoustic space around this line of orientation, towards the end, the last component also decomposes, etc. You have these very noisy sounds which become longer and more noisy, more like, I don't know, etc. And then they end in very heavy and noisy sound, which is the head of the next section, which I then will interpret under the perspective of the multi-layered space composition. We hear it again, and I recommend that we switch off the light. And I would even say, please, once, close the eyes as well, that you are not disturbed by any visual thing that's going on in this room, and follow the sound itself. And just try to catch as much as possible of the components leaving and their behavior, their process of floating in masses, in swarms, we can say, of individual pulses around this line of orientation. Are you ready? Then please switch off the light. We literally discover a sound which has been covered before. The last sound, like a very heavy sound event, almost white noise like at the ocean, the whoosh, this whoosh, but also with low frequencies in it, is, as I said, the head of the next musical process. which is a more static one and which is concentrating on the extreme of noise composition in this work. Now we are confronted with several layers, and I have to say something about the development of space composition in music since 1954-5. What I said about time, that people have a certain middle position in time, judging on what is faster and slower, and that this middle position is determined basically by our body, by the breathing, by the heartbeat, by the speed with which I can move, my limbs, the fingers included, my tongue, my lips, my head, etc. This determines a middle range of speed, and everything that is faster or slower, we judge from this position. The same is true in register, where our voice is, our natural voice. We consider the middle of orientation. There's our point of perspective, and everything that is much higher or much lower, we call it higher or lower. So even for women, let's say, the higher and lower is approximately an octave transposed in comparison to men. But there we again have so-called middle position of orientation, and this, for most of the people, is fixed. It's very hard to move in a musical composition of a more modern character listeners into another region. Let's say to stay for quite a long time in a very fast region, so that fast becomes the normal, and that everything that was medium before in traditional music becomes slow. Or the other way around, that I make a composition in which I have longer sections which are so extremely slow that they have never occurred in our traditional music, and we consider them very, very slow. Let's say like in gagaku music, the Japanese court music, very slow music. Then, having listened for a longer time to this very slow music, everything that was medium in speed up to that moment becomes fast, etc. There you see the change of perspective which has happened through the enormous expansion of musical timing, and nowadays a modern composition switches very fast from one time layer, from one tempo into another. Whereas, as I said before, in traditional music, we had the slow movement, the fast movement, and then there was an intermission in between, and then we had the very fast, and then the minuet movement, etc. We stayed, so to speak, in one perspective for a while. We were safe. With the modern means of traffic, naturally, this has changed a lot. We see someone walking, we move in a car, there is an airplane passing, which is very slow, extremely slow compared to my walking, and then maybe a bicycle is passing by. I mean, all sorts of means, or I go on an airplane from the car and change from a very fast time into a slow time. What concerns my experience, because in an airplane everything becomes very slow. See, compared to the car, where the trees are passing by very fast, etc. So there we change time very quickly. And the modern man is able just to change very quickly. And if he doesn't, he gets sick, or he even dies. Because the degree of change is just too fast.